Again to Android Developer Office Hours. I'm Joe Mallon, your moderator. Next to me is Trevor Johns. And
Howdy.
beside him, down at the end of the table, ignoring us, is Alex Lucas. Our engineer today is Robert Lee. And
the world is shifting around Alex.
The world is moving around Alex. It revolves around him. So with no further ado, let's go to moderator and take our first question for today. From Zelyatsko in Sofia, Bulgaria. What's the best approach for an app with a lot of web API calls? Now I'm using a service plus one async task for all API calls and ugly interfaces to talk to the UI. Should I use a separate async task for every API call? And how to communicate to the UI properly? Thanks.
Alright, so it's a service and an async task for the API calls, and they want to know if it's okay to use separate async tasks for every API call. I think that's probably okay depending on the nature of your API. So the thing to watch out for with async task is if your application ends for some reason. Say you rotate your screen and it relaunches. The system's going to restart your app. Those async tasks are never going to complete as far as your UI is concerned. And I think will they still run in the background? I can't remember. It's iffy. I wouldn't rely on that behavior. They may not. So if you're just like fetching some information, that's fine. If you're making something, something that's a destructive change, right? You're editing something, you're posting new data. That's when you need to be a little bit more careful and make sure that your async task actually can run to completion, or at the very least that it's not something that's so important that the world will end if your app does restart. So if you're making a blog post, right, and the user posts it, you need to make sure it actually appears. If you make it so that when your app restarts, you check to see if that's posted, you're probably fine. Now, that said, there are some benefits to using a service as a background process, and that is that you have a lot more control over things like fetching new data. So the advice we usually give people when they're using web services inside of their Android app is to make sure that you're pulling your data in before the user asks for it. So when the user's actually in your UI, they get a nice, fast, responsive experience. On top of that, users don't always have an internet connection, or it might be a bit flaky. So if you're on a plane or commuting to work, you might be passing through some tunnels, or again, a plane's a perfect example. The user probably still wants people to read their information. If let's say you're a feed reader, right? The user still wants access to the RSS feeds. If you have a background service, you can go and make sure all of this is cached and available inside of a content provider. If you're just doing an async task to get it live, all of that's going to fail. So I think that's really the big benefit to use a service. And so for that reason, yeah, you probably can make it work with an async task, but our usual advice is not to. Alex, did you have anything else you wanted to add on to that?
Sure. I'd just really quickly like to address the part of the question where he says, is one async task for all calls okay, or should I use, spin up a new async task per call? And I think if you're in a situation where you have a lot of calls happening, like let's say the app you're writing is like the front end for a web service, or if you're doing some sort of batch thing like downloading 1,000 images from the internet, if you don't go the service route, the better option is really to just create a full-blown background thread. So async tasks are really designed they're really optimized for like very quick tasks, like maybe pulling weather information off the network, or writing something to a file or writing something to a database. If you're doing something that's going to take a significant amount of time, or if you have a whole bunch of different tasks that you're queuing up like that, the best option is really to have a background thread that just sort of sleeps and waits for new commands. And then you can just send those, send a request for a file or something like that to the background thread. The other part of the question I noticed was about the quote-unquote ugly interfaces for the UI. There's a facility called a handler that lets you sort of ship data back and forth and like commands back and forth between the UI thread and background threads, and I would look into using that. Without more information on what you're doing currently, I can't really say whether those are whether your current approach is the right or wrong way, but definitely look into handlers.
Okay. Any other comments? Great. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
We got two questions from the internet.
Okay, let's have the first one.
Let's go for it.
Not getting sound. No? Are we in the mute?
Hit the volume up button on the computer, Robert. Let's see if we get some audio out here. Oh,
No.
we don't.
Hold on just a second.
Yeah. Let's go back to moderator. I'm going to go and step
Okay,
over
fine.
and debug the stuff on the soundboard.
Bear with us,
yeah.
and we'll come back to you.
Do you want to mute my mic for a second, Robert, so that we don't deafen people?
Okay, we're going to go back to the moderator for just a second while we take a look at some technical issues here, and ask this question from Akil in Ashburn, Virginia. I'm a beginner to Android application development. Do you recommend reading the API guide straight through? That's what I've been doing. The Android training doesn't really feel in depth.
All right. I guess since Trevor isn't in front of the camera at the moment, I'll be taking this one. Reading the API guides is actually a really good way to become familiar with Android development. I should say that the API guides and Android training serve two separate purposes. The API guides are more designed for a particular topic to give you an overview of the API and all the little features and method calls and the important elements of it. The Android training classes are more task-oriented in terms of, I want to sync with a web service, or I want to efficiently load bitmaps, or like they're very like task-based in it. I want to accomplish this, and then a step-by-step lesson, like a series of step-by-step lessons within a particular topic of how to go about the steps that you go through in order to accomplish that, and the relevant API calls. We also provide code snippets and sample code. But yeah, the API guides are really good reading. I would recommend, instead of just reading, which doesn't do a lot for retention of a topic, especially programming, your best option is actually...
Sorry, Alex.
No worries. Your best option is actually to have an idea, like a small sample, not necessarily a small sample project, but a small exercise. Like if you're learning how to do networking code, learn how to pull an image off the internet or something, and then write a small sample app that does that. Joe also, we were discussing this beforehand, and he also brought up the great point that it's good to have an overarching project in mind when learning a new language or a new platform. And that way you can get a bunch of topics that you sort of learn simultaneously as you're incorporating these features into your project.
Want to add anything, Trevor?
I didn't catch the question because I was busy fixing the sound.
Android, beginner to Android application development, do you recommend reading the API guide straight through?
Okay. It's really, I think it's mostly a question of how do you learn, how do you like your content delivered. I know some people they do like reading through the documentation in the format we provide. It's probably a bit more fast-paced than what you'll find in a longer book that's more geared towards beginners, right? We assume that you have a background in the Java language. We assume that you're familiar with most of the concepts involved in GUI programming, and we do rush through things a bit because we assume that the audience has a solid background in this stuff. And most people, I'd say, when especially if they're getting started, more if they're coming from a different environment, might not be familiar with all of that. And the documentation's all out there, but you have to go and you have to take a look at our site. You might have to look through the Java tutorials for some of the language stuff. And with those cases, I think you might find a book to be better. We like to. I'm a fan of Rado's book, but there's a lot of good ones out there. And some people also like video tutorials, and there's a lot of those out there as well too. So it's really just a matter of how do you like your information delivered. I do think that the API guide especially is probably not the best way to go, but Android training and the tutorials and the developer guide, all great places to start. I think they do cover everything you need to know, but again, it's a different pace.
I would. I'm a technical writer on Android, and so I feel like I understand something about all of the different stuff we've written about. I would say that the API guides were not designed to be read straight through in order, or you don't need to read all of them in order to understand how to develop an Android. I can understand that you might feel that Android training doesn't feel like it's in depth, but it'll give you an idea of some of the tools that you can use to write Android applications, as in async tasks and other things like that, and also the types of problems that you might run into when you're writing an Android application. So if you just review them, even if you just skim through them, you can get started on a project, and then if you need more help on a particular topic, you can look at the API guide for that topic.
Right, and just to give you an idea of how I got started with Android, I read through the first, the first 5 pages, I think, under the introductory material, life cycle of an application. What does an activity look like? How do you do a UI? All the really basic stuff is clustered right there at the beginning of the developer's guide, and then from there you can go and read the individual sections as you come across problems you'd like to solve. I do agree with Joe. Reading everything on there is a pretty daunting task, and it's not structured to really be read that way. You certainly could, but that's going to take you quite a while.
Right. Okay. Since we have somebody in the Hangout waiting to ask a question, let's go to him now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes,
we can
can.
hear you now.
And Robert, did you unmute the Hangout computer on the soundboard, going out live? There you go. Now people on YouTube can hear you.
Okay, so I actually have 2 questions. The first one's fairly simple. At Google I/O, one of my coworkers asked about using web APIs to sync shared preferences, and we were told that if we just waited a few weeks, there would be a product release that would allow us to do that. Is there any update on what that is?
I'm not actually sure what that would be.
Okay, because
Alex, Joe, do either of you know what that's in reference to?
No.
Oh, wait,
the 2 gentlemen who gave the talk at Google I/O, I'm afraid I don't remember their names, but they specifically told us that there was something coming out specifically to sync shared preferences using web APIs.
Do you remember the name of the talk by any chance?
Yeah, it is building Android applications that use web APIs.
That would make sense, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know what topic they're referring to off the top of my head, but I can we can track down the guys who gave the talk and ask them.
Yeah, it's Yaniv Inbar.
Okay, yeah, I know him. Yeah, he actually is in charge of a lot of stuff related to our overall API strategy at Google. So it doesn't surprise me that we don't know about it, because he is not part of the Android team. He's part of the broader API team, again, for all of Google. So it doesn't surprise me that there's something going on. We haven't heard about it yet. We'll get some more info from you, and we'll pass it along. We're going to go and try and recap all the questions we can't answer at the beginning of the show the following week. So if you can tune in just at the start of the show next week, we'll get that answer for you. And if you can post actually, probably this isn't the best question for Stack Overflow. Yeah, so tune in next week, we'll get you an answer and have some more info.
And you had another question?
Yeah, the second question is involving fragment transactions with compatibility library. I have basically a linear layout that contains multiple fragments, and what I want to be able to do is replace one of them with another fragment, and because I don't know at the time of replacement if the number is identical or not, so I completely erase the row and refill it with fragments. The removal process works great. The problem is I remove all the fragments, I commit that change, and then I try and add new fragments, and nothing happens.
Do you commit the change of adding the fragments?
Yes. Yeah, it's within one function, I iterate through all the fragments that are stored in that layout, calling remove on each one. I commit that, and then on all the fragments that I want to add to that row, I do an add and then commit that after the for loop.
I don't know off the top of my head why that would.
Yeah, I'm very confused because I don't get any logcat messages. Literally nothing other than that I see the results of the removal, but I don't get the results of the add.
Does it work if you re-add them in a separate way? Like if you do the removals and the adds of the new fragments in the same transaction?
No, I tried that, that didn't work, so I thought, maybe I'm having some sort of an issue with that, so I put them to 2 separate transactions. That doesn't work. Calling invalidate on the layout doesn't work. I have this question posted on Stack Overflow, but I haven't really gotten any hits on it.
I think we probably need to see your code for this. So
Okay,
if you could
it's
take the link to
posted,
your
so
Stack
I'll
Overflow
link the
question
question.
and post it in the comment thread on Google Plus for this live stream right now. We'll go through after the show, find your question, and take a look through your code. Because it sounds like what you're doing should work. It's probably something really subtle, and so if you post some code, we can try and sort that out for you. Just make sure, usually when I ask people to do this, the link sometimes winds up in the wrong place. So again, make sure you find the stream right now on Google+, post a link to your Stack Overflow question there, and we'll find that.
Right, this is the event page, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry we couldn't be more help. We have somebody else on Hangouts. Go ahead. Nobody.
Silence.
Okay. Silence. Might have gotten bored and left us, but we encourage you to come back if you still have a question, and we encourage everybody else out there that if you want to ask a question, it's perfectly okay to write in or join the Hangout and ask a question. I think we've got a limit of like 10 people on the Hangouts, which is why we don't encourage everybody to just jump in, but to the
Jump in if you have a question.
Jump in if you have a question. Don't just jump in, and we'll answer it. Okay, next from moderator. What are your best practices on writing a web API that will be interacting with Android? Are there particular data structures in JSON, URI construction, or API side behaviors that will make the Android interactions more seamless? And that's from Hussein in the Colorado GDG, Colorado.
All right. I can't say there's really anything that makes working on Android any easier. I mean, most web APIs have been, the underlying method of writing them has been designed to work, in a way that works on any language, right? So you have, I'd say most people tend to have standardized on the RESTful design pattern. So basically, if you're not familiar with that, the idea is you have a collection of nouns which represent whatever object you're interacting with, a person record and an event record, whatever it is, and then you use the normal HTTP verbs: get, put, post, delete, patch, things like that to go and make modifications to the data. When you access those URLs, most people either will use XML or JSON. I think either of them is equally easy to work with. If you're using XML, just make sure that you're using a SAX-style XML parser rather than something based on DOM, because mobile devices have limited memory. If you use JSON, I'd say JSON tends to be one of the better JSON parsers available, but JSON's pretty lightweight, so feel free to use whatever works for you in that case. Though again, keep an eye out for memory constraints. If you have a very large tree of objects you're reading in, it might not make sense to load it all into memory at the same time. Again, just depends on what you're working with. Other than that, it's really what works best for your application, and I don't think really one pattern over another is really going to make more of a difference on the Android side. It's really just a matter of what's easier to program with.
Okay.
All right. Hey, Matthew.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Hey, 2 questions actually. One, I'm trying to look into the file system on Android, and basically I got my Android on Google Play. I can download to my device using like DDMS or something to take it off the device. It's in the Mount ASEC folder, and it won't let me move the file. Is that the new app encryption that Google Play is doing?
That's correct.
Device-specific encryption?
Mm-hmm.
So we get the thing off the device? Okay.
Yeah, so if it's an ASEC, that's all an encrypted file system and not something that you'll be able to
Is it only
modify.
work on certain devices? Because I can take it off my phone, which is an old Gingerbread. I have no problems accessing that folder whatsoever. But on Jelly
yes,
Bean,
I believe
can't.
encryption was enabled on, I want to say it was on Jelly Bean,
okay.
and it's only for paid applications.
Mine's free.
I'm surprised it's encrypted then.
So, yeah.
At least that was my
but it's
understanding. I'm not mistaken, am I?
I heard a rumor about it being on all applications, but I know
it might
it's
be
also
for all
supposed to be.
applications now. My info might be a bit out of date. But
think
it was
I-
definitely added in Jelly Bean, so...
Yes.
Right.
Okay. The other one is any ideas on how to look into a JavaLang verify error when running the app on the either an emulator or on a device when you ask Java to verify the class before it goes to all the decks and everything. Is perfectly fine.
Is this what API level are you targeting for this?
This is like 2. I'm just making it like 2.2.
All right, because I know prior to Android 2, you would get a verify error if you used an API call that was not available on that API level yet. On
Okay.
2.2 though, it shouldn't be an issue.
Because I'm running it on a Jelly Bean device.
Okay.
And getting that error. And I've tried different emulators, and they all give me the JavaLang verify error. But I take the APK, decompile it, take the dex, take it back to the dex to jar, look at the jar files, and Java says no problems at all with the class files. So.
Interesting.
Okay. I'll look at it some more. Thanks.
Yeah, the only thing I could wonder is if you're making a reference to a class that doesn't exist, possibly. Though I think even that should still work too. And like you said, you're on Jelly Bean, so
Yes.
it's probably not an issue with the system APIs in that case. Possibly something inherent to the way your application is structured.
Okay. I'll look into that. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? No? Okay, back to moderator. Next question is from Julian Brost. Is it possible to enhance Google Now as an app developer? That is, provide more data or custom cards?
Not at this time. So you can, to give you a little more information, I mean, Google Now doesn't have an API, so there's no way to extend it. But one thing you can do, I don't recommend people do this, but it is possible to go and override the Google Now action. So when you hold down on the home button and slide up from there, there's a little Google logo that pulls up Google Now. You can technically replace that with your own app if you want to provide something that's a replacement for Google Now, all of Google Now. But again, I don't really recommend that because Google Now is pretty cool, and as a user, I don't think I'd want it replaced on my phone. But that's right now. That's the only option available.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Ramon in Finland. I'm planning to use a private key to hash the payload sent to the web API. I guess it's impossible to keep it 100% secure, since it's possible to get the APK and decompile it. Anyway, what are the best practices to keep the key in my Android app safe?
Okay, that's a little bit tougher because, like you mentioned, it's entirely possible to decompile an APK, and if you have your private key stored in there, somebody looking at the bytecode will be able to find it and remove it. So I'd say, given that, your best option would be to obfuscate that key somehow. So just probably the easiest way to somebody to go and remove a key if they're going to try and do it would be to just run strings on your app and see what strings are contained in there. So probably a good alternative would be to create some sort of a seed for your key and use some cryptographic function to go and convert that into a suitably sized key. Hey Robert, could you mute the speaker? Sorry, that's sort of distracting. Basically, it's the same idea like with a passphrase. When you log into a Wi-Fi network or something like that, the passphrase provided is usually not long enough to actually become a suitable cryptographic key. So there's various algorithms that actually go and extend that into something that's 512 or however many bytes long that you need for your actual key material. A good example of this, I'm trying to remember the name of the algorithm. I don't think anybody here remembers off the top of their heads, do they?
Give us a better hint.
Yeah, well, it's an algorithm that converts a passphrase into a longer key. No, I think we're probably going to have to look it up, I think. But anyway, if you take a look out there, there are algorithms that basically will extend a passphrase into something larger. And that would be a good way to go and hide your key. Alternatively, if you... I guess actually you could even use something like MD5 or SHA-1, just generate a hash of your key. And then basically that way when somebody goes and looks at the strings, they're not seeing your verbatim key stored in there. Now I do want to caution there is some advice out there that I want you not to follow, and that is don't use secure random to generate your key fill material. So what I usually see people do in this case is they'll go and create an instance of secure random, generate or feed their passphrase essentially in as their random seed, and then generate however many bytes of random data, assuming that since they're always using the same seed, they'll always get the same random data back out. And the actual answer is that is not guaranteed to happen, and I've seen some apps break pretty badly because of this assumption. So please, please, please do not use secure random to generate fill material. Anything else that's deterministic should be fine. Alternative or other things you could do, you could go and concatenate multiple strings. You could basically provide or apply any sort of transformation to your original string so that way the original key can't be read out. And I'd say that's the best practice in this case. MD5 SHA-1 is probably good enough.
Any other comments? No?
Nope.
All right. We'll move on to the next question. This is from Mr. Hidden Android in Croatia. Is there a way to enable full development access on stock devices? We now can allow installing debug APK files, enable USB debugging and developer options, but we can't use really helpful hierarchy viewer when testing on stock devices. And a sad face.
All right, so I guess there's two parts to the question here. The first question is it possible to go and enable full development access? And to do that, you need a custom ROM. So Android normally has three ways of building. The normal user build, which is what you'll find on pretty much any retail phone you buy. And then there's also a user debug build and an eng build, which enable increasing levels of access to the system at the cost of performance and security. We don't recommend most people use those builds. Again, there are security implications if you do so. But if you are making a phone that's just for development purposes, you can go to source.android.com, check out the source code there, make your own build, assuming that drivers are available for your device. Not all devices have drivers there, so you're going to want to check and see which device you have and how well it's supported. But that said, it sounds like what you really want is hierarchy viewer. And if that's the case, there's an even better solution, and that is to download something called ViewServer. ViewServer is the code that is responsible for export that generates the server that hierarchy viewer connects to. It's part of the system, but you can also place it into your app and run that same application entirely in user space. So if you go to Romain Guy's GitHub page, or just search on Google for ViewServer, you'll find it as the first result, I'm sure. And you can go ahead and just drop those files right into your application. I think there's a few changes you make to your manifest as well. And what you'll find is when you try and connect, as long as that code is part of your application, ViewServer will work, hierarchy viewer will work just fine. No special OS build required. And that's our recommended way of getting hierarchy viewer to work on a real phone. Of course, you can also run it on an emulator and it'll work just fine there because emulators, I believe, are they user debug? I think emulators are user debug build. So that's the other alternative.
Okay, great answer. Thank you very much. Next question is, this week's Android Design in Action showed a spinner below a text view with horizontally left-aligned text. Any recommendations on how to implement that? And that's from Toby in Germany.
Yeah. I'll grab this one.
Okay.
So I went ahead and looked at the video that you linked to, and from my understanding, it isn't actually a text view hovering over a spinner. It's just a spinner with one of the rows selected as its default, or as the default value that it's showing. So that's why I think the question, the asker Toby was under the impression that it was sort of a text view hovering with a hierarchy order like over the spinner. And that's not it. It's like there's just a spinner there. As far as how the text is left aligned, that's easy. That's just an XML attribute. Just set Android gravity to left, and it'll left align the text.
Okay, good. Great answer. Thank you very much. A question from Molo in Portland, Oregon. Can I restrict a start dragged object so that the dragged object can only be dragged to a certain area? I have a list view that I want to drag a row to another position. I'd like for the dragged row image to only drag vertically, not horizontally. any answers from you guys? Because based on my sort of hazy memory of how this works, I don't think there is.
Yeah, I can't recall a way to do this either.
I don't think there's a way. Even if there is, just speaking as a user, I don't know that I would like that experience where the thing that I'm dragging is sort of following my finger, but sort of not. I think it's pretty intuitive if you're dragging a list view item around that you can only drag it to other areas in the list. So I would leave that as is.
I kind of understand the question because there's a gesture in like Mac or Windows where you say hold down the Shift key and move the cursor or use a cursor arrow, and that restrains the movement to one axis rather than
Right.
moving it all over the screen. But I don't think that's as necessary on an Android device.
Right. That's
And-
usually for drawing a line or something as
Yeah.
opposed to moving an object
Right.
to another location.
So I just don't think that the current API supports that. Okay, next question. Web UI, I'm sorry, from Anon, whoever that is. Web UI guests, just after the end of the talk, you referred to a new functionality which, we had that question.
That was our live question.
Yes.
That
Okay.
said, I think there's actually one more thing we should probably mention on this topic.
Okay.
And that is the backup API. Now, the backup API is a service that's provided as part of Android, where you can take, typically a shared preferences file, and ask to have it sent to typically a server on the cloud, and that'll get replicated across other devices when the user restores their data. Now, it's not the same as something that's actually doing a full sync and merging in changes across lots of different devices. That's still a topic we need to follow up with Yaniv and get some more info for you. But if you're just trying to go and persist the user's data somewhere that'll survive, a phone replacement or the user, basically just loading in all their settings, the backup API is a pretty good option for that. Now, it doesn't always save to the cloud. It's up to device manufacturers to decide where this data is saved. I've seen some devices that'll go and save data to SD card rather than to the cloud, but I think most devices coming out now do sync to the cloud. And again, that's a good option for certain use cases, so just keep that in mind.
Great, thank you.
Got a question in the moderator.
Go ahead.
Give me a second.
You mean in Hangouts?
Yes.
That's Hangouts.
Hangouts.
Here we go. Shoot.
Yeah, later on the list, we utilize some web APIs in our app that can contain some very large
Yep.
JSON responses. This can cause our app to run out of memory. It might be due to memory pressure from other things going on the app, but how do you suggest handling such large responses?
Excellent question. So if you control the API, you could go and page your responses, so that way you only load up a few pieces of data at a time. It depends on the nature of your application. That might or might not make sense. Within that, this is sort of what I was mentioning earlier about DOM versus SACS in the context of XML. DOM, you actually go and load the entire representation of an XML tree into memory, whereas SACS is a streaming parser. It'll go and read through everything and generate events as it come across certain elements, but at no point you have to go and load the entire tree into memory. And so if you're finding that you are encountering similar problems in JSON, and JSON really is a lot, most JSON parsers work a lot similarly to how a DOM-based XML parser works. Just go and, I'm not familiar with any streaming JSON parsers. There's got to be one somewhere out there. I'm not sure what it's called. But failing that, you could just write your own that literally just scans through the through the JSON data and emits events when it comes across certain apps, and you can use that to extract the data you need. So, say that each element within your JSON tree has a title, a URL, and another, few hundred K worth of data, just to use an extreme example. You could just go and extract the URL and the title, and then when the user clicks on it, you could go and make a call to that URL to fetch the additional data at request time. And that way you can ease up some memory pressure there.
Do you have any? Let's say that's not an option. Are you aware of any good streaming JSON parser or any other way to sort of relieve some of that that hurt that's going to come by streaming all that content into the app.
I'll have to do some research after the show, and I can recommend something, assuming something exists. I'm sure there is something out there. Again, not familiar with the name off the top of my head, but we'll try and find something for you as far as a good streaming JSON parser. But as far as saving memory pressure, that's always a really difficult issue in Android apps because you are sharing the device with a lot of other apps. And on top of that, it's on a mobile device, so memory is limited. It is definitely different than working on a desktop or server. And there's really not much you can do about that other than to write your application to use as little memory as possible. Now, there are some flags you can use that will get you some additional heap space, but we really don't recommend people use them. It gives a bad user experience because it'll start evicting other apps from memory when they shouldn't be. And on top of that, the amount of memory they give you is actually not guaranteed. So it's entirely possible that using these flags will get you no extra space at all. It's really just a hint to the OS, and then the OS decides how to handle it. So really, I can't really give you any better advice other than you're going to need to be conservative in your memory usage in general.
If I can ask, roughly how big is the JSON that you're downloading? Like how much data are you trying to process at one time?
It can be several Ks, I think.
You should have enough. So like 10 kilobytes or less then.
No. I'm sorry. I don't know if it's. I don't have exact rough numbers, but I know it can be very large, paragraphs of text on that order of things.
Okay, paragraphs you should be fine. I mean, I'd say as long as you're a few hundred K or less, no problem. I'd say even up to a megabyte. I mean, that's the size of a large photo, right? Or actually, a megabyte would be a small photo. But anyway, I mean, I'd say up to that size, you're probably still safe. So if you're running out of memory with paragraphs, that sort of tells me that there's something else wrong in your app, and you're just. I'm really curious what in your app is using up all available memory, but I'd expect you'd be running into other problems just besides your JSON at that point. I mean, that's not a lot. Most devices have, gigabytes of memory. I mean, not a lot of gigabytes. Maybe a gigabyte, maybe half a gigabyte. But I mean, at that scale, you're less than a meg. That's a very small fraction of system memory, and keep in mind the system will evict other apps as necessary to make sure your app, as the foreground app, has enough memory to run. So by the time you've run out of memory, you really have exhausted everything the device has that it can give you. So I think there's something else in your app that's causing these problems. It doesn't sound normal to me.
Have you looked at any sort of memory monitor to look at what structures are being generated by your app that are taking up memory?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of UI going on. We've got other resources being downloaded and integrated into the system, and it's entirely possible that this is just a large enough hit into the system that it's just taking us over the top. But we don't experience this out of memory in any other area except when we're loading up this JSON.
Interesting.
Yeah, that is an interesting problem.
So if you are able to find a streaming JSON parser, that would be awesome.
We can find for you. I think that's probably the best approach here. Given that, I mean, like, it's entirely possible too that I'm just guessing. Maybe you occasionally run across an abnormally large block of JSON data. I mean, the problem you're having is very similar to loading bitmaps from the internet, and bitmaps are fairly large. The advice we usually give is there's enough space to load twice your screen size in the Java heap, and any reasonably sized block of JSON data is going to be less than that. So yeah, you probably are just right at the edge there, but we'll see what we can find that can help with this.
What parser are you using right now?
Yeah, I was going to ask.
Just so that we don't
we're using Jackson. We found it to be the fastest.
Sorry?
Jackson.
Okay.
Okay. Any other comments?
Let me just make a note here.
Okay.
We will, yeah. So as far as advice, like I said earlier, we'll dedicate a few minutes of the next show to go over any questions we couldn't answer. So we'll have an answer for you then. It'll be 2 p.m. next Wednesday. Be sure to tune in.
Yeah.
Alternatively, you can also leave a comment on the event page, and we'll follow up on the event page that way too. So that way we can get you an answer quicker.
Thank you. Yes? Are there anybody else there? Okay, so we'll move on to the next question and moderator, which is from Kristovaler in Tallinn, Estonia. I think that Android is very close to being feature complete, but why does it seem like not enough effort is put on HTML5 support, which is still very laggy on mobile, even on quad-core, and why are there still no user accounts, especially guest?
I'm not sure we can actually really answer too much about that, because that's really going into the roadmap as far, for Android, which is something we generally can't talk about, at least not publicly. Now, as far as HTML5 support, I'd say a lot of the effort lately has gone into Chrome, and as a result, the built-in WebView client is a little bit lacking in features. That's sort of a complicated issue because not all of Chrome is open source. It is something the team's working on, but I can't tell you how they're going to address that. Again, that's a forward-looking statement that we can't talk about on the air. But I mean, these are all good points, and we definitely listen to the feedback from the community in deciding how we spend our engineering time. So I'll just take this question as a feature request and make sure that gets passed along.
Okay. Okay, so the question is there a way of adjusting the padding on the label for the spinner?
So on the text within the spinner, I guess he wants to left align that within the spinner.
I see. Okay. So the question is, how do I left align text within the spinner itself?
Right. Okay. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. Is Roman lurking in the Hangout by any chance? 'Cause he always knows the answer to the layout question. No, Roman? I was hoping if we said his name a couple times, it would sort of summon him. We'll have to look into that a bit and have an answer for you next week. Also, if you could link, if you want to ask the question on Stack Overflow, and then link to that Stack Overflow question within Moderator, we can go and answer it there, and it's a handy place for us to
Moderator, I think,
sample code.
the Moderator section for this week might be locked by the time they do that. So if you can't post a Moderator, again, go to our event page on Google Plus and make a comment there, and we'll follow up with you that way too.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. Next question from Moderator. What would you recommend if your Android app needs to interact with a SOAP web service? This is from Bellinghammer.
SOAP. Fun. Use REST. What are you thinking, SOAP? No.
You don't always have control.
I know, you don't.
I think that was said in jest.
It was. I'm just not a fan of SOAP myself.
Right.
But, actually, I'm not familiar with any really good SOAP libraries in Android. Does anybody else know one?
I don't know one off the top of my head, but I think the point of SOAP is sort of, you don't need a SOAP library so much as you need something to generate the code to interact with that web service for you.
Right.
That's the point of SOAP, is you don't have to understand SOAP, which is kind of odd. It's kind of a weird approach. We all of us prefer REST, but if you can find a Java utility that will, not necessarily Android specific, but find one that will generate Java interface files and then modify those to use the web clients available on the Android?
I usually recommend against doing that though, because a lot of the web services libraries that you'll find for Java in particular are designed for desktop environments, and they're really not conservative when it comes to memory usage, and you run into problems with them. So I'd actually go out of your way to find one that's specifically designed for Android.
Right.
With that in mind, I just did a quick search here. There's one here at the top of my search results called KSOAP 2 Android. I don't have any experience with it, but it does say it's a lightweight and efficient SOAP client library for Android. So that might be a good place to start.
I didn't know there actually was one for Android. That's cool.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. I think there's if you
there's
Google
enough
stuff out there.
Yeah, there's enough SOAP web services out there that, like you said, you can't control what web service you're interacting with if you didn't write it. So it's good that these client libraries are out there. If you are writing new APIs, please use REST. It makes me happy. But other than that, SOAP itself, as an end user, there definitely are some benefits of using it. And yeah, I just did just so you know, I did a search for SOAP Android on Google. There's also one right under it called Android SOAP Enabler. Again, we don't have any experience with either of these APIs, so feel free to give them a try. Let us know what you think, actually, so we can give feedback to other people who are asking similar questions. But we can't endorse either of them.
Okay, we're getting towards the end of the hour here, so let's move forward pretty quickly. Here's another question from Bellinghammer. After doing some profiling, it appears that most of the time spent in some HTTPS-based web service requests is downloading and validating the server certificate. Is there a way to cache the certificate for subsequent requests?
I'm not sure you want to. That certificate validation needs to be done on a per request basis to make sure that nobody has tampered with the response coming back from the server. I mean, this is of course assuming that you're using HTTPS. If you're using HTTP, none of this applies. But if you are using a secure connection, there's probably a reason you're doing that. And every request needs to be validated to make sure that, say that somebody hasn't gone and swapped out your certificate using a man-in-the-middle attack. These things are rare, but there are reasons there are reasons why SSL and TLS exists. There are attacks that do this sort of thing, and you need to check for it. Unfortunately, there's really not a good workaround there. Now, some of the work done on Speedy is specifically trying to go and speed up SSL and TLS, and so you could use I imagine there's probably a Speedy library out there for Android. I think so anyway. Chrome probably uses it. I'm sure there's a way to go and get that working, but most servers out there I don't think support Speedy yet. But this is precisely the sort of problem that engineers are working on right now to go and try and speed up SSL. So it's a valid question. Unfortunately, it's not an easy answer.
A Hangout question.
Go ahead.
Asking about a REST question.
Sorry, we missed the beginning there.
Yeah, you got a REST question?
Yes, correctly. Obviously, consuming REST services is pretty cool. So the question is there a better way to consume a REST service besides only using raw Apache HTTP client or the URL connection? Is there any library you would recommend which helps in mapping resources to URLs and this kind of stuff?
So I used to work on the GData team, and like I said, I worked with Yaniv back when I was on that team, working on a lot of the APIs here at Google. And we spent a lot of time writing client libraries that were very very tightly focused on different APIs. And it did make things a lot easier to work with, but on the other hand, it's a lot of effort to maintain those. And it actually, in a lot of cases, added a lot of complexity, I found. And as a result, I think pretty much everyone on the API team actually usually preferred just to use curl whenever they were testing something, rather than going through all the effort of trying to set up a client library.
Okay.
Now that said, that's not to say that you couldn't write a very nice, clean client library that's very targeted to a very specific use case and get really nice results. But I think that the beauty of REST is it's designed to be very easy to use without a client library. So I think there is there's a case in writing client libraries in a service-by-service basis. So say you want to talk to, just pulling an example off the top of my head, say you want to talk to Google Cloud Messaging, right? It would make sense to write a Google Cloud Messaging library that knows all the intricacies of that service and then marshals your HTTP requests for you and makes everything very clean. You never have to know the raw protocol. I think that's a valid effort. But I think trying to make a very generic REST client library, you wind up writing something that looks exactly like an HTTP client library, but more likely than not adding a lot of complexity on top of it. So I'm not convinced there's a lot of benefit there. If you do happen to know any really good client libraries for doing this, let me know. I'd love to take a look at them because it is something I've worked on in the past, but nothing. I've never found anything I really liked that tried to do it.
I actually have had some experience with CREST. It's a very small library, and it mimics the way JAX RS or Jersey works with annotations. And that was pretty cool, but it's very small and only maintained by one person. So it's not something to rely on a daily basis. But the approach was pretty cool because you had only those annotations and everything else is pretty nice. And I think there is definitely room for such a library, but I just don't know any which is suitable.
Well, you can get to work on it.
Yeah, and I'm definitely going to be taking a look at CREST.
The Google attitude is if you see something broken, you fix it. But I would Google it too and see if there's somebody out there doing this. I mean, if there is space for it, maybe somebody has done it. But I tend to agree with Trevor that by the time you come up with something that's general purpose enough to address all the different sorts of things, you're dealing with a lot of complexity in trying to map specific things into a general purpose client library.
Now, are you trying to communicate with your own web service or some other third-party web service?
That's a third party, or just any REST service, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. The solution that I've used in the past, I wrote an app once that communicated with like 10 or 11 different web services. And the strategy I implemented was that I would bug them and ask them to write a client library in my language of choice. And I would make a case where it was written in C# actually, but I made a case for the whole, like, there's all these C# developers who want to build awesome things for you, but you know, they can't unless you just like give us a client library and we'll build awesome things and make you money.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah,
a lot of the times they would. So I would definitely don't be afraid to just bug people and say, build me an Android client.
Okay, that's a good idea. I'll try.
Okay.
Thanks for your question. It's a good question.
Thanks. Goodbye.
Anybody else out there? Okay, as far as I can tell, we only have one question left. So, and I think we answered this already, but this is from Minsko in Milford, Ohio. Where do apps get installed on Android? I see a Mount ASEC on my Nexus 7. Is that where Google Play puts the apps with device-specific encryption?
To which the answer was yes.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so I think we've covered that. Anybody else out there? Now's your chance to jump into the Hangout and get your question answered immediately. Yes? No?
Yes, I have a question.
So we have a question. Shoot. Hello?
Yeah, hello?
Yes.
Yeah.
I tried to develop a web service whose data were web server, and I wonder if your local host works with HTTP client.
Sorry, I didn't catch quite that. Something about a web server?
Web server.
Yes. So can you repeat the question, please?
And I wonder if yes, I wonder if the local host works with HTTP client. Because I tried to develop a web service.
Yeah, did you catch what he's trying to use?
Yeah, I'm still not getting it. Is it possible that you could type in the question for us?
Yeah.
And bear with us for just a second. No? Well, he's typing. Okay, good.
It's okay. We have a couple minutes left.
Yeah.
Literally a couple minutes. This is where we need some theme music, like
Right.
the Jeopardy theme.
The Jeopardy theme would be good, or
I think the Jeopardy theme's been played out.
it's been done. Yeah, right.
I like the Katamari Damacy theme for waiting music.
Yeah,
would be good, yeah.
that would be epic.
Unfortunately, if we played it over YouTube, we'd have to mute the entire video.
Yeah.
To scrub the video.
Yeah.
That's the problem with a lot of those
Or-
games. is
or
it's all
pay licensing
copyrighted.
fees.
Yeah,
Right.
you have to find something that's freeware.
We need some Creative Commons waiting music.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the music we use at the intro of the show.
Yes.
Yes.
Or we can
Did-
just accept sponsors. If a band wants to create some
Right.
playing music
Did we
for us, we'll credit
Get something
them
here.
appropriately.
Here.
All right, we got the question now.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I try to develop a web service whose data is on a LAMP server, and I wonder if localhost runs with HTTP client.
Okay. So you're basically trying to develop a web app that's running on the Android device, and then accessing a local server running on the Android device. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. So yeah, I think that's actually possible. You do have to request a permission to indicate that you want to run a server, I believe, and then you just go ahead and open up a local port. There's a lot of other cases where that's actually useful. For example, for the longest time, that used to be a recommendation to people who are trying to do something really complicated with streaming video, and DRM and things like that. Is run your own local server to go and buffer to the video stream to the local media playback system. But I mean, in your case, I think that's entirely possible. That being said, it is a bit heavyweight. You have to go and run your web server. You're gonna have to run whatever backend language you're using, and that's on top of whatever's going to be rendered in the web view. So I usually don't recommend that people take that approach. If you're really going to do this, I'd recommend writing everything in JavaScript if possible. That's going to be a lot friendlier, both in terms of CPU and memory usage. And you can do pretty much, since you're all interacting locally anyway, there's really no reason why you couldn't do everything you're doing in PHP inside of JavaScript. And again, like I said, a lot of these languages, like PHP, are designed to be run on a server where you have gigabytes and gigabytes and gigabytes of memory available at your disposal. And on a mobile device, you really don't. You might have a gig total to everything on the system, and as an application developer, you're limited to hundreds of megabytes, if not tens of megabytes. So PHP really, the problem there is going to be getting PHP to fit into memory.
Right. That's a good point. It strikes me, though, that I'm sure that somebody must have tried to tackle this before, so I'm wondering if looking through Stack Overflow or even Google itself would come up maybe with some solutions for doing that sort of server running on a device.
I'm sure people have tried, but again, the problem is it's it's not a good architecture, is what I'm saying.
Right. I'm not saying
you're wasting
right.
CPU and memory.
I'm not saying that running the LAMP stack on Android device, but running something that is tuned specifically for Android that accomplishes the same net effect. Somebody may have come out with a lightweight solution, because I agree with you. Trying to run the LAMP stack in Android is going to be a real challenge.
Yeah, I think the lightest weight solution, though, is just to go and load your HTML file from disk, and then again doing everything probably in JavaScript is going to be your easiest option. And plus, JavaScript's sort of a cool language. You get to deal with prototypes and all that fun stuff. Definitely pretty different than PHP, but it's a fun language to learn.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. I think we're out of time. So
yeah, we've run over. Sorry about that, but it was a good question at the end.
It was a very good question.
Yeah.
I actually liked it.
Thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you again next week. Anything to add?
I believe next week's topic is going to be on sensors. Don't quote me on that. I think it's still tentative. Most likely, we're going to have somebody on here who can talk about sensors, but stay tuned to our Google Plus page. We'll make a formal announcement, let you know what the topic is for sure. As always, we broadcast Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Pacific time. Feel free to ask us questions in Moderator before the show, or join us live and ask us questions via Hangout. All right.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us.
See you, everyone.